The morning of June 13th, 1944, 7 days after D-Day, the fields outside Caumont-le-Repas, France, approximately 15 miles inland from Omaha Beach, Private First Class Eddie Moretto of Company C, 26th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, pressed himself against an earthen embankment so ancient its origins predated the Norman Conquest. Above him, tangled roots of hawthorn and oak created a canopy 12 feet high. Ahead, through a narrow gap in the hedge, lay another small field, perhaps 200 yards across, then another hedge, and another field, and another hedge stretching to a horizon he couldn't see. This was the bocage, the Hedgerow country, and 7 days after the greatest amphibious invasion in human history, after American forces had stormed Hitler's Atlantic Wall and carved out beachheads that cost thousands of lives, the advance had stopped, not from German counterattack, not from lack of supplies or men or material, but from terrain that hadn't changed in 1,000 years. Behind Moretto, a Sherman tank revved its engine. The 30-ton machine lurched forward, climbing the 4-foot earthen bank. As the tank's nose tilted skyward, its lightly armoured belly exposed to the next field, a sharp crack echoed across the hedgerows. The Sherman shuddered, black smoke pouring from its engine compartment. A German Panzerfaust had found its target. The crew bailed out, scrambling for cover as machine gun fire raked the disabled vehicle. Another American tank reduced to burning scrap metal, another crew lucky to escape with their lives. What none of them understood in that moment, what General Omar Bradley himself wouldn't fully grasp for another 3 weeks, was that the bocage had transformed the nature of warfare more profoundly than any German defensive doctrine. The hedgerows had taken the American advantage in tanks, artillery, and air superiority, and rendered it nearly meaningless. They had converted the most mechanized, mobile army ever assembled into infantry struggling field by field through a medieval maze. And unless someone found a solution, the breakthrough from Normandy that was supposed to take weeks might take months, or might not happen at all. The mathematics of the hedgerow problem were brutal and simple. From D-Day on June 6th to mid-July 1944, American forces in the western sector of the Normandy bridgehead advanced approximately 20 miles in 6 weeks. That calculated to less than 1/2 mile per day. In some sectors, progress was measured in yards. A battalion might spend an entire day capturing a single hedgerow-enclosed field, only to face another identical field beyond it, and another after that, each one a potential killing ground. The casualties told the grimmer story. Rifle companies in the 1st, 4th, 9th, and 29th Infantry Divisions suffered casualty rates approaching 60% among enlisted men and nearly 70% among officers between June 6th and July 31st. The 90th Infantry Division, relatively inexperienced, lost 150 officers and 2,315 enlisted men in June alone, then 310 officers and 5,188 enlisted men in July. These weren't losses from massive set-piece battles. They were casualties from a grinding, claustrophobic struggle that consumed men a few at a time, day after day, hedgerow after hedgerow. The hedgerows themselves were not natural formations but human constructions shaped by centuries of agricultural practice. Norman farmers, beginning in the Middle Ages, had cleared stones from their fields and piled them along property boundaries. Over generations, these stone piles accumulated earth. Farmers planted hedges on top for windbreaks and to mark boundaries. The hedges grew, roots intertwined with rocks and earth, creating solid embankments averaging 4 feet high, and equally thick at the base. On top, hawthorn, brambles and small trees grew another 8 to 12 feet, sometimes 15 feet in places. The total height of these living walls reached 12 to 15 feet, occasionally higher. The enclosed fields they created were small, irregular, and varied wildly in size. Aerial photographs from June 1944 show approximately 3,900 hedgerow-enclosed fields in less than 8 square miles. Fields averaged 400 yards long by 200 yards wide, though many were smaller. Some were barely 100 yards across. Entrances were limited, narrow gaps just wide enough for a farmer's cart or livestock. These gaps, called bocage in French, gave the entire region its name. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. For a German defender, the Hedgerows created a defensive system more formidable than any fortification engineers could have designed. Each field was an enclosed position, with natural cover on all four sides. Machine gunners and riflemen could dig fighting positions directly into the earthen embankments, protected from overhead artillery fire by the thick earth and roots. Observation was limited to one field at a time. An American soldier crossing the center of a field was exposed to enemy fire from three sides, all from positions he couldn't see until he was already in the kill zone. The Germans recognized this advantage immediately. While Allied planners had studied aerial photographs of the Normandy coast extensively before D-Day, they had largely dismissed the hedgerows as a minor tactical nuisance. Pre-invasion training had not addressed hedgerow combat. American infantry tactics were built around fire and movement in open terrain, with units advancing behind rolling artillery barrages and supported by tanks. None of these assumptions held in bocage. German infantry, by contrast, had been fighting defensive battles since Stalingrad. They understood how to maximize limited manpower through terrain exploitation. In the hedgerows, a handful of experienced soldiers with machine guns could pin down an entire American battalion for hours, even days. German commanders positioned their strongest units in the bocage deliberately, recognizing that the terrain multiplied their effectiveness. The tactical problem facing American forces was straightforward to describe, but nightmarish to solve. To advance, infantry had to cross open fields under observation and fire from three sides. Artillery preparation often proved ineffective because the hedgerow embankments absorbed or deflected shells. Even direct hits on a hedgerow rarely killed troops dug into the opposite side of the embankment. The thick earth and root systems dissipated explosive force. Air support, America's greatest advantage, became nearly useless. Fighter bombers couldn't distinguish friend from foe in the compartmented terrain. The view from above showed only a patchwork of small fields and hedges. Distinguishing which field held German defenders and which held American attackers was impossible. Close air support, the tactic that had proven devastatingly effective in North Africa and Italy, couldn't be employed effectively in the bocage without unacceptable risk of hitting American forces. Tanks, the symbol of American mechanized warfare, became vulnerable targets rather than decisive weapons. A Sherman tank had three options for crossing a hedgerow, and all three were tactically disastrous. First, the tank could attempt to crash through the hedgerow at a gap or weak point. This exposed it to pre-positioned German anti-tank weapons covering every known crossing point. Panzerfausts and Panzerschrecks could penetrate a Sherman's armor at close range, and in the hedgerows, every engagement was close range. Second, the tank could attempt to drive through the embankment itself. But Sherman tanks, while reliable and numerous, lacked the power to bull through earthen walls, packed with centuries-old roots and stones. The tank would bog down halfway through, stuck and exposed, an easy target. Third, and most common, the tank could climb over the hedgerow. This maneuver exposed the Sherman's greatest vulnerability. As the tank's nose tilted skyward, climbing the embankment, its lightly armoured underside became visible to defenders in the next field. The belly armour of a Sherman measured only 1.5 inches thick, compared to 3 inches or more on the frontal armour. A Panzerfaust striking the underside could penetrate easily, igniting the Sherman's gasoline engine and ammunition storage. American tankers called their vehicles Ronsons because they lit the first time, every time, a grim joke that reflected their terror. For tankers, the hedgerow country became a recurring nightmare. Every advance meant exposing their belly armour to an enemy they couldn't see until it was too late. Tank commanders learned to keep their turrets closed, protecting themselves from snipers, but reducing their situational awareness to the view through narrow periscopes. They crept forward at walking speed, their powerful engines idling, unable to use their mobility or firepower effectively. The infantry suffered differently but equally. American infantry doctrine emphasized fire superiority and aggressive movement. In the bocage, fire superiority was impossible. Rifle fire that might be effective at 300 yards in open terrain was useless when visibility ended at 100 yards or less. Machine guns, the backbone of infantry firepower, had their effective range reduced by half or more. The Americans' advantage in automatic weapons largely disappeared when every firefight happened at ranges where a German soldier with a bolt-action rifle could aim and fire effectively. Movement became a calculated risk every time. To advance, infantry had to expose themselves, crossing open fields or move along sunken lanes that were natural kill zones. German defenders would allow American units to enter a field, then open fire from multiple directions simultaneously. The Americans would take casualties immediately, often including squad and platoon leaders who advanced at the front. Survivors would seek cover behind the nearest hedgerow, pinned down, unable to advance or retreat without additional casualties. The artillery problem was particularly frustrating. American artillery was the most effective in the world, capable of bringing down devastating fire missions within minutes of a forward observer's call. But in the bocage, the hedgerows themselves interfered. Artillery shells striking trees or thick vegetation often detonated prematurely, exploding above ground rather than upon impact. This reduced lethality against dug-in troops. Furthermore, the compartmented terrain made target identification difficult. Observers had limited visibility. Calling accurate fire on a German position one hedgerow away was challenging when you couldn't see that position clearly. Combat engineers tried using demolitions to blast gaps in hedgerows for tanks to pass through. The theory was sound. A properly placed explosive charge could create a tank-sized opening in an embankment in seconds. The reality was deadly. The explosions attracted immediate German attention. German artillery and mortars would bracket the freshly blown gap. Any tank attempting to use the opening became a target for every German anti-tank weapon in range. Engineers suffered heavy casualties placing charges under fire, only to see the gaps they created become death traps. By late June 1944, American commanders faced a crisis that threatened the entire Normandy campaign. The beachhead was secure. Cherbourg had fallen on June 27th, though the port facilities were so thoroughly demolished by retreating Germans that the harbour wouldn't be operational for weeks. Supplies and reinforcements continued flowing across the beaches. More than 1 million American, British, and Canadian troops were now in France, but they remained wedged in a bridgehead roughly 50 miles wide and 20 miles deep, held in place not by German counterattacks but by terrain. General Omar Bradley, commanding the U.S. First Army, understood the strategic implications. The entire Allied plan for liberating Europe depended on breaking out of Normandy quickly, driving across France before German reserves could organize a coherent defense. Every day spent grinding through the hedgerows gave Germany more time to shift divisions from the Eastern Front, to reorganize shattered units, to prepare defenses deeper in France. The spectre of stalemate, reminiscent of World War I's Western Front, haunted Allied headquarters. The bocage was consuming divisions. Units that had fought effectively in North Africa and Sicily were bled white in the hedgerows. Soldiers who had stormed Hitler's Atlantic Wall under withering fire found themselves more terrified by the invisible enemy in the next field. The constant stress of advancing through terrain where death could come from any direction at any moment without warning was breaking men's nerves. Combat fatigue cases increased. Soldiers developed what they called hedgerow stare, a 1,000-yard look that came from too many days of too close combat. The problem reached up to the highest levels of Allied command. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, visited Normandy in early July and saw the hedgerow fighting firsthand. His frustration was evident in messages back to Washington. The Allies had won the beaches. They had established their lodgment. They had assembled overwhelming force. Yet they couldn't break out because medieval farming practices had created terrain that negated 20th-century military technology. The British and Canadian forces on the eastern end of the Allied line faced different terrain around Caen. Open ground, better suited for armoured operations. But Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's attempts to break through there had been repulsed with heavy casualties. German panzer divisions, including elite SS units with Tiger tanks, were concentrated in the British sector. Montgomery's battle became an attritional slugging match that gained little ground. This left the American sector, the bocage, as the location where the breakout would have to occur. But how? The conventional solution was to amass overwhelming force at a single point, blast through with artillery and air support, then exploit with armor. Bradley planned exactly this for Operation Cobra, scheduled for late July. The plan called for carpet bombing by heavy bombers to destroy German defenses, followed by a massive ground assault. But even with this firepower, success depended on tanks being able to move through the hedgerows once the bombing opened a gap, and tanks still couldn't cross hedgerows without exposing their vulnerable undersides. Throughout June and the first weeks of July, American units experimented with hedgerow crossing techniques. Some tried using explosives to create ramps on hedgerow embankments, allowing tanks to climb at gentler angles. The results were mixed. The explosions took time and attracted enemy fire. The ramps often collapsed under a tank's weight. Tank dozer blades, fitted to some Sherman tanks, could bulldoze through hedgerows, but there were too few dozer tanks available, and the slow process of clearing hedgerows one at a time wasn't fast enough for a breakthrough operation. Other units tried using infantrymen as guides, directing tanks to weak points in hedgerows or clearings between fields. This improved coordination but didn't solve the fundamental problem. Tanks still exposed their belly armor. Casualties among both infantry and tankers remained high. The advance continued at a crawl, field by field, hedgerow by hedgerow, consuming time and lives the Allies couldn't afford to waste. In early July 1944, various American divisions began developing their own hedgerow cutting devices. The 79th Infantry Division created a cutter operational by July 5th. The 19th Corps demonstrated a set of prongs that could be used to lift sections of hedgerows. Units within the 5th Corps invented devices they called brush cutters and green dozers. Each division was independently trying to solve the same problem, creating various contraptions to help tanks breach hedgerows without exposing themselves. But it was a Tennessee hillbilly named Roberts, whose full name has been lost to history, who made the observation that would change everything. During a discussion among tankers in the 2nd Armored Division about the hedgerow problem, Roberts made a suggestion that seemed so obvious. His fellow soldiers laughed at him. "Why don't we get some saw teeth and put them on the front of the tank and cut through these hedges?" The laughter reflected the frustration of men who had been trying every conceivable solution without success. Saw teeth? On a tank? It sounded ridiculous, like something from a cartoon rather than a serious military proposal. Besides, everyone knew that hedgerows were too tough to cut through. They were centuries-old embankments of earth, stone, and intertwined roots. You couldn't just cut through them. But one man didn't laugh. Sergeant Curtis Grubb Cullen III, a 29-year-old tanker from Cranford, New Jersey, heard something different in Roberts' suggestion. Cullen was with the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, part of the 2nd Armored Division. He'd been in Normandy since shortly after D-Day, and he'd seen firsthand what the hedgerows were doing to American armor. He'd watched Shermans get stuck climbing hedgerows. He'd seen tanks bellied out, helpless targets with their crews scrambling for survival. He'd lost friends. More importantly, Cullen had grown up during the Depression. He was born on February 10th, 1915, which made him old by infantry standards in 1944. Most soldiers were in their early 20s or late teens. At 29, Cullen had experienced the economic collapse, had learned to improvise, to make do, to solve problems with whatever materials were available. He didn't think like an engineer with formal training. He thought like someone who'd survived hard times by figuring things out. Roberts' suggestion stuck with Cullen because it reframed the problem. Everyone else was trying to go over or through the hedgerows using brute force. Roberts had suggested cutting through them, not bulldozing, not climbing, cutting, like using a blade instead of a hammer. The more Cullen thought about it, the more sense it made. The hedgerows weren't solid walls of stone. They were earth embankments with vegetation. If you could cut the roots and vegetation at the base, the earth would give way. A tank could push through on level ground, its belly armor protected, maintaining its firepower and momentum. Coulin started looking for materials. The answer was literally scattered across the beaches of Normandy in vast quantities. German beach obstacles. Before D-Day, German engineers had planted thousands of obstacles along the Normandy coast to prevent amphibious landings. Among the most common were Czech hedgehogs, large anti-tank barriers made of crossed steel I-beams welded together at angles. Each hedgehog weighed hundreds of pounds and was designed to rip the bottom out of landing craft or stop tanks cold. The Allies had cleared these obstacles after the invasion, pushing them aside or destroying them to make way for the continuous flow of men and supplies across the beaches. Thousands of Czech hedgehogs now lay in piles behind the beachhead, useless scrap metal from a defensive system that had failed to stop the invasion. The steel beams were high-quality, heavy-gauge construction steel designed to withstand the impact of ships and tanks, and they were free for the taking. Coulin requisitioned several sections of steel beam from demolished Czech hedgehogs. Working with other tankers and maintenance personnel, he began cutting the beams to length. The design that emerged was elegantly simple. 4 steel prongs, each about 3 feet long, cut at angles and sharpened to points. The prongs would be welded to a horizontal mounting plate that attached to the front of a Sherman tank, low on the hull, just above the transmission housing. The key insight was positioning. The prongs had to be low enough to dig into the base of the Hedgerow embankment, where the earth met the stone and root system. Too high, and they'd glance off or get caught in vegetation. Too low, and they'd dig into the ground, slowing the tank. Coulin calculated the angle by eye, based on his experience seeing how hedgerows were constructed. The prongs angled slightly downward and forward, designed to bite into earth and roots. The welding had to be solid. The force of a 30-ton tank pushing against centuries-old hedgerows would stress the metal tremendously. Weak welds would fail on first contact. Coulin worked with maintenance crews to ensure the mounting plate was welded directly to the tank's structural frame, not just surface-mounted. The entire assembly weighed several hundred pounds of additional steel on the front of the tank, but Shermans had sufficient power to handle the extra weight. By early July, Coulin had a working prototype mounted on a tank. The question was whether it would work in actual combat conditions. The theory was sound. The execution looked solid. But theories and prototypes were worthless if they failed under real battlefield stress. Coulin needed a demonstration, needed to show commanders that this crude-looking contraption of salvaged steel could solve the problem that had stymied an entire army for 6 weeks. The opportunity came on July 14th, 1944. Major General Leonard Guerreau, commanding the 5th Corps, was visiting 2nd Armoured Division positions. Someone had told Guerreau about Coulin's invention. Guerreau, in turn, called his superior, Lieutenant General Omar Bradley. Bradley, desperate for solutions to the Hedgerow problem with Operation Cobra looming, decided to see the device for himself. Early on the morning of July 14th, Bradley arrived at the demonstration site near the 2nd Division's positions. With him were Hedgerow and several other senior officers. They found Coulin's modified Sherman positioned in front of a typical Normandy hedgerow, an earthen embankment 4 feet high topped with dense hawthorn and bramble. The hedgerow looked like thousands of others that had stopped American armor for 6 weeks. The Sherman's engine roared to life. The tank lurched forward, accelerating to approximately 10 miles per hour. The steel prongs hit the base of the hedgerow, biting into earth and roots. For a moment, resistance held. Then the hedgerow exploded. Earth, roots, vegetation burst upward and outward in a geyser of debris. The tank powered straight through, its hull remaining level, its belly armor protected by the prongs and mounting plate that took the impact. Within seconds, the Sherman had crossed the hedgerow and emerged in the next field, ready to fight. Bradley watched in stunned silence. Then, according to witnesses, he broke into a wide grin. The solution to the hedgerow problem had been staring them in the face the entire time. Not some complex engineering marvel, not a new weapon system, just steel teeth welded to the front of a tank, using scrap material from German beach obstacles. It was so absurdly simple that the army had spent 5 weeks trying everything else first. Bradley immediately grasped the implications. With this device, American armor could cross hedgerows without exposing vulnerable belly armor. Tanks could maintain speed and surprise. They could burst through hedgerows and engage German defenders before those defenders could react. Tank infantry coordination would improve because infantry wouldn't have to expose themselves, clearing crossing points. The entire tactical situation would shift in America's favor. Bradley turned to his staff officers. "I want these on every tank we can get them on before Cobra kicks off." That gave them approximately 10 days. Operation Cobra was scheduled for July 25th, depending on weather. In 10 days, the U.S. Army needed to manufacture hundreds of hedgerow cutters and install them on tanks across multiple divisions. It was a massive undertaking, but Bradley understood that success in Cobra might depend on whether his armor could move freely through the bocage once the breakthrough started. Cullen, characteristically, tried to give credit to Roberts, the young soldier whose offhand suggestion had sparked the entire invention. But in the publicity that followed the demonstration, Roberts' name was forgotten or never properly recorded. The device became known as the Cullen hedgerow cutter or the Cullen rhino device. Cullen himself would later receive the Legion of Merit for his invention, one of the few enlisted men to receive such recognition for a technical innovation rather than combat valor. The manufacturing effort began immediately. Engineers from 1st Army Headquarters worked out standardized specifications for the cutters. The design was refined slightly for mass production, but the basic concept remained Cullen's original idea: 4 prongs welded to a mounting plate. The steel source was unlimited, thousands of demolished Czech hedgehogs waiting to be repurposed. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. German steel intended to stop the Allied invasion would now help American tanks break out of Normandy. Army ordnance companies became fabrication centers. The 111th Ordnance Company was one of several units tasked with producing the cutters around the clock. They worked under camouflage netting to prevent German observation of what they were doing. Welders like Joseph Apple worked day and night shifts, cutting sections of I-beam to length, sharpening the ends with grinders, welding prongs to mounting plates, then welding the completed assemblies to the front of Sherman tanks. The work was demanding and dangerous. The steel beams had to be cut with torches or heavy saws. Each prong needed a precise angle and sharp edge to penetrate hedgerows effectively. The welding had to withstand tremendous stress. No weak spots, no incomplete penetration. Welders worked in teams, one preparing materials, another welding, a third inspecting finished work. Quality control was constant. A failed cutter in combat meant a disabled tank and a dead crew. By July 23rd, just 2 days before Operation Cobra's scheduled start, more than 500 Cullen cutters had been manufactured and installed. Nearly 60% of 1st Army's Sherman tanks now sported the distinctive steel prongs. From above, they resembled rhinoceros horns, which gave the modified tanks their nickname, rhinos. The sight of an entire armored division of rhinos lined up for attack was both impressive and slightly absurd, all those jutting steel prongs making the tanks look like mechanical beasts ready to charge. The British Army had heard about the American development and created their own version, called prongs. British Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers produced 24 initial cutters from German beach defences, then shifted production to the United Kingdom. By August, 600 Mark I prongs had been delivered for Sherman 5 tanks. An additional 1,000 Mark II prongs were produced for Sherman's and M10 tank destroyers, and 500 Mark III prongs for Cromwell tanks. Churchill tanks, which weren't considered to need the device because of their superior cross-country capability, received some prongs. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. But the question remained, would the Cullen cutters work in actual combat? A demonstration for generals was one thing, a real battle was another. Combat had a way of revealing flaws in equipment that testing never caught. The only way to know if the Rhino tanks would break the Hedgerow stalemate was to send them into battle and see what happened. Operation Cobra was the test. The entire breakout from Normandy depended on whether American armor could exploit the breakthrough that carpet bombing and infantry assaults would create. If the Rhino tanks worked as designed, 1st Army might finally escape the bocage and reach the open country beyond where American mobility and firepower could be fully employed. If the cutters failed, the breakout would stall in the hedgerows, and the stalemate would continue, perhaps indefinitely. The stakes could not have been higher. By late July 1944, the Allies had been in Normandy for 7 weeks. They had secured the beachhead, captured Cherbourg, and assembled overwhelming force. But strategic success required breaking out of the bridgehead and driving deep into France before German reserves could stabilize the front. Every day of delay helped Germany, gave them time to rush reinforcements from the Eastern Front, to fortify positions farther inland, to organize counterattacks. The German army in Normandy was battered but not broken. American intelligence estimated German strength in the region at approximately 50,000 combat-effective troops in the western sector, with additional reserves available. German units were under strength, exhausted from weeks of defensive combat, short on supplies and ammunition. Dangerous opponents, well-led, experienced, and fighting from excellent defensive terrain. The German command structure had adapted to the hedgerow fighting. They recognized that small units with heavy weapons could multiply their effectiveness by using the bocage's natural advantages. German doctrine emphasized defense in depth, fallback positions, and quick local counterattacks to recapture lost ground. They had learned to position anti-tank weapons to cover hedgerow crossing points. Machine gun teams were dug into embankments with carefully cleared fields of fire. Mortar crews could drop rounds behind hedgerows with brutal accuracy, hitting American troops in supposedly safe positions. For American tankers preparing for Operation Cobra, the Rhino modifications represented hope mixed with uncertainty. The devices looked tough enough, heavy steel solidly welded, but nobody knew how they'd perform under combat stress. Would the prongs break on first impact? Would the welds fail? Would. The hedgerows prove too tough even for this innovation. The only way to know was to attack and see what happened. The launch of Operation Cobra was delayed multiple times by weather. Heavy bombers needed clear skies to deliver accurate bombing. Ground forces needed decent visibility to coordinate the assault. July 24th looked promising, but deteriorating weather forced a postponement at the last minute. Some bombers had already departed England and didn't receive the recall order. They dropped their payloads on target, unfortunately killing several dozen American soldiers in short drops. The attack was rescheduled for July 25th. July 25th, 1944, began with the largest carpet bombing operation of the war to that point. 1,500 B-17 and B-24 heavy bombers dropped approximately 3,300 tons of bombs on a rectangular area northwest of Saint-Lô. The bombardment was supposed to create a 3-mile gap in German defenses through which American armor and infantry would pour. The reality was more complicated and more tragic. Weather remained marginal, visibility was limited, and once again, some bombers dropped short, hitting American positions along the front line. 111 American soldiers were killed, nearly 500 wounded. Among the dead was Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, commander of Army Ground Forces, who had unwisely joined frontline troops to observe the attack. The friendly fire casualties were devastating psychologically as well as physically. Soldiers who'd survived the bombing watched their own aircraft kill their comrades. But the bombing also devastated German defenders. The Panzer Lehr Division, holding the sector where the main American thrust would occur, was effectively destroyed as a fighting force. Fritz Bayerlein, the division commander, described a pall of dust with fountains of earth spewing high in the air. Communications were cut. Tanks were overturned. Survivors were left stunned, disoriented, traumatized by the scale of the bombardment. At approximately 1 in the afternoon on July 25th, American ground forces attacked. The 7th Corps, under Major General J. Lawton Collins, nicknamed Lightning Joe for his aggressive tactics, led the assault. Collins had proven himself during the capture of Cherbourg and was Bradley's most trusted corps commander. If anyone could exploit the breakthrough, it was Collins. The initial advance was cautious. Infantry moved forward through the bombed zone, encountering scattered German resistance. Progress was slower than hoped. Some German positions had survived the bombing, either through luck or because they were dug into hedgerows that absorbed blast effects. The 1st Infantry Division and other assault units reported tough fighting despite the massive preparatory bombardment. But Collins made a crucial decision on the afternoon of July 25th. Rather than wait for infantry to fully clear the attack corridor, he committed his armor exploitation force early. The 2nd Armored Division, equipped with Rhino tanks, would punch through while German defenses were still reeling from the bombing. It was a calculated risk. Armor moving through incompletely secured terrain could be vulnerable. But Collins gambled that speed and shock would compensate for the risk. The 2nd Armored Division, accompanied by elements of the 3rd Armored Division, attacked on July 26th. This was the moment of truth for the Cullen cutters. Hundreds of Sherman tanks mounting steel prongs advanced into the Hedgerow country that had stymied American armor for 7 weeks. Behind them came infantry, artillery, tank destroyers, the entire combined arms team that American doctrine envisioned. The difference was immediate and dramatic. Rhino tanks hit hedgerows at speed, their steel prongs biting into earth and roots. The hedgerows exploded as 30-ton tanks powered through. German defenders, positioned to engage tanks at hedgerow crossings or catching tanks climbing over embankments, suddenly faced armored vehicles bursting through unexpected locations. The carefully prepared defensive positions that had worked so effectively for weeks were bypassed or overwhelmed. Tank commanders described a sensation of liberation. For the first time since landing in Normandy, they could maneuver their vehicles without constant fear of exposing belly armor. They could choose their own routes through the bocage, rather than being channeled into predetermined crossing points. They could maintain speed, using their mobility as it was designed to be used. The psychological effect was as significant as the tactical advantage. American tankers felt they were back in control of the battlefield. German resistance began to collapse, not everywhere and not immediately, but the coherent defensive system that had held the Americans in check fractured under the pressure of armor that could move freely. German units that had held their positions for weeks suddenly found themselves bypassed, surrounded, or crushed by tanks attacking from unexpected directions. The retreat began slowly at first, then accelerated as unit cohesion broke down. By July 27th, American forces were advancing at rates not seen since the days immediately after D-Day. Combat Command B of the 2nd Armored Division covered several miles in a single day. Infantry following the armor mopped up bypassed German positions. Artillery moved forward rapidly to support the exploitation. The breakout that had seemed impossible just days earlier was suddenly happening. The Rhino tanks didn't win the battle alone. The carpet bombing, though tragic in its friendly fire incidents, had shattered German defenses sufficiently to create the opening. American infantry fought with skill and determination, clearing positions and supporting the armor. Artillery provided crucial fire support. Air cover prevented German counterattacks. Victory came from the combined effectiveness of all these elements working together. But the Rhino tanks were the enabling factor. Without them, American armor would have stalled in the hedgerows beyond the carpet-bombed zone. The breakthrough would have been confined to a narrow corridor, easily sealed off by German reserves. The Cullen cutters gave American commanders the freedom to maneuver in terrain that had previously been impassable to armor. That freedom transformed a tactical success into a strategic breakthrough. By July 28th, just 3 days after Operation Cobra commenced, the advance had busted wide open. The 30th Infantry Division, which had suffered many of the friendly fire casualties at the start of the operation, reported that things on the front really looked good. Bradley messaged Eisenhower with understated optimism. The exploitation was working. American forces were finally out of the bocage. The operational impact cascaded through German defenses. Field Marshal Gunther von Klug, commanding German forces in the west, tried desperately to organize counterattacks, but his units were scattered, under strength, and caught in the open as they tried to move toward the breakthrough. American air superiority devastated German columns trying to reach the front. Tank units ran out of fuel. Infantry divisions lost contact with higher headquarters as American forces cut communication lines. The 7th German Army, responsible for defending the sector where Cobra struck, effectively disintegrated. Combat units were overrun, surrounded, or forced into headlong retreat. Supply lines were cut, ammunition stocks captured or destroyed. The careful defensive system the Germans had built in the bocage was bypassed entirely, as American forces drove past it into open country to the south. On July 30th, American forces captured Avranches, a crucial crossroads town. Its capture opened the way into Brittany to the west and deep into France to the east and south. The Normandy campaign, which had been a grinding stalemate for 7 weeks, suddenly became a war of movement. The Germans no longer had a coherent front line. They had scattered units trying to escape encirclement and destruction. The German response to the American breakout was hampered by confusion, fuel shortages, and Hitler's strategic delusions. Rather than authorizing an immediate withdrawal to more defensible positions, Hitler ordered a counterattack. Operation Lüttich, launched on August 7th between Mortain and Avranches, was supposed to cut off the American spearhead and restore the German front line. The attack was mounted by already exhausted and under-strength units that had been fighting continuously since D-Day. The counterattack failed catastrophically. American forces, now operating in terrain where their mobility and firepower could be fully employed, crushed the German assault. Allied fighter bombers devastated German armor columns moving in daylight. American artillery, no longer constrained by hedgerow terrain, delivered devastating fire missions with precision. The German units committed to the counterattack were effectively destroyed, losses they could not replace. By August 8th, just 2 weeks after Operation Cobra commenced, American forces had captured Le Mans, formerly the German 7th Army headquarters. General George Patton's Third Army, activated on August 1st, was now driving east and south in a sweeping exploitation that covered distances measured in tens of miles per day rather than yards. The transformation from hedgerow stalemate to rapid maneuver warfare was complete. The broader strategic implications rippled across the entire Western Front. British and Canadian forces on the eastern end of the Allied line launched their own offensives, taking advantage of German forces drawn westward to counter the American breakthrough. The German position in northwestern France became untenable. Field Marshal Walter Model, who replaced Günther von Kluge after Kluge fell under suspicion following the July 20th assassination attempt on Hitler, recognized that the entire German army in Normandy faced encirclement and destruction. The Falaise pocket became the final catastrophe for German forces in Normandy. As American forces drove east and Canadian forces drove south, they threatened to surround the German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army in a massive pocket near the town of Falaise. Hitler, refusing to authorize retreat until far too late, condemned tens of thousands of German soldiers to death or capture. When the pocket finally closed in late August, the carnage was immense. Approximately 50,000 German soldiers were killed or wounded, another 50,000 captured. Hundreds of tanks, thousands of vehicles, artillery pieces, and equipment were destroyed or abandoned. For the soldiers who fought through the Taper, Falaise pocket, the scenes defied description. Entire roads were clogged with destroyed vehicles, dead horses, and corpses. Allied aircraft had strafed and bombed the retreating columns mercilessly. The smell of death hung over the countryside for weeks afterward. Journalists who witnessed the aftermath compared it to Dante's Inferno. The German army that had held Normandy for 2 months was effectively annihilated. The liberation of Paris followed on August 25, 1944. Free French forces under General Philippe Leclerc, supported by American units, entered the city to scenes of jubilation. The symbolism was profound. Paris, occupied since June 1940, was free. The Nazi grip on Western Europe was broken. The Allies were now positioned to drive toward the German border and beyond. All of this flowed from the breakthrough at Normandy, and the breakthrough at Normandy had been enabled by a simple innovation that allowed tanks to cross hedgerows. The Culin cutter hadn't won the war by itself, but it had removed a critical obstacle at a critical moment. Without it, Operation Cobra might have stalled in the bocage. The Americans might have remained trapped in the hedgerow country through August and into September, giving Germany precious weeks to fortify positions deeper in France. The human cost of those 7 weeks in the hedgerows before the Cullin cutters became available remained a sobering counterpoint to the ultimate victory. American infantry divisions that fought through the bocage suffered casualty rates comparable to the worst battles of World War I. The 90th Infantry Division's combined losses of over 7,000 men in June and July represented nearly an entire division's worth of riflemen lost and replaced. Similar casualty figures marked other units that fought extended periods in the hedgerows. The psychological scars lasted beyond the physical wounds. Veterans of the bocage fighting spoke afterward about the particular terror of that combat. Not the dramatic fear of charging across open beaches under machine gun fire, but the grinding, daily dread of advancing through terrain where every field might contain an ambush, where visibility was measured in yards, where death could come instantly from an unseen enemy. The hedgerow veterans developed their own informal brotherhood, recognizing in each other the 1,000-yard stare that came from too many days of too close combat. Curtis Cullen's personal war continued after Operation Cobra. He remained with his unit, fighting through France and into Germany. 4 months after his invention helped break the Normandy Stalemate, Cullin stepped on a landmine in the Hurtgen forest during another brutal campaign. The mine cost him his leg. He was evacuated to England for treatment, then returned to the United States for recovery and discharge. After the war, Cullin married Bernice Enright in 1945. They settled in New York City, where Cullin took a job as a salesman for Schenley Industries, a liquor distribution company. He lived a quiet civilian life, rarely speaking publicly about his wartime service or his invention. When journalists or military historians tracked him down for interviews, Cullin consistently tried to give credit to Roberts, the soldier whose offhand suggestion had sparked the entire innovation. But Roberts's full name and unit were never properly recorded. History forgot him, remembered only through Cullin's attempts to ensure he received recognition. Cullin died on November 20th, 1963, at age 48. His obituary in the Cranford newspaper mentioned his wartime service and his Legion of Merit, but devoted more space to his civilian accomplishments and his family. He was buried in Westfield, New Jersey, a veteran of a war that had ended 18 years earlier. Most people who knew him in civilian life had no idea he'd invented the device that helped break the Normandy Stalemate, but the military establishment remembered. General Omar Bradley devoted several paragraphs to the Cullin cutter in his memoir, A Soldier's Story, describing how the absurdly simple device had baffled an army for more than 5 weeks. President Dwight Eisenhower, in one of his final addresses before leaving office in January 1961, told the American Society of Mechanical Engineers about Sergeant Cullin's invention, using it as an example of how frontline soldiers often see solutions that evade higher command. Eisenhower's account captured the essence of why the Cullin cutter mattered beyond its immediate tactical value. The invention represented a principle that modern militaries still struggle to implement: listening to soldiers in the field, trusting their observations, empowering them to innovate. The hedgerow problem had been visible to every tanker and infantryman fighting in the bocage from June 6th onward. Everyone knew tanks couldn't cross hedgerows safely, but it took a junior enlisted man taking seriously an idea that others laughed at to actually solve the problem. The organizational implications were significant. The U.S. Army in 1944 had elaborate research and development programs, engineering departments, ordnance specialists, armor experts. Yet none of them had anticipated the hedgerow problem or developed solutions before the invasion. The failure wasn't from lack of resources or expertise, but from the disconnect between high-level planning and battlefield reality. The planners had looked at aerial photographs of Normandy, seen the hedgerows, and dismissed them as minor obstacles. They hadn't understood how those obstacles would interact with American tactics and German defensive doctrine. This pattern repeated throughout military history. Technological solutions developed in laboratories and proving grounds often failed to address the actual problems soldiers faced in combat. Meanwhile, soldiers improvised solutions using available materials and practical knowledge. The challenge for military organizations was creating systems that identified these field innovations quickly and scaled them across the force before the tactical opportunity disappeared. The rapid production and deployment of the Cullen cutter represented one of the American military's genuine strengths, the ability to mobilize industrial capacity and organizational resources when the need was identified. Once Bradley saw the demonstration on July 14th and gave the order to produce the cutters at scale, the system responded with impressive speed. Within 11 days, over 500 cutters were manufactured and installed, transforming the capabilities of First Army's armor just in time for Operation Cobra. This responsiveness came from America's industrial base and from organizational cultures that emphasized practical problem-solving over rigid adherence to doctrine. When welders like Joseph Apple received orders to produce Hedgerow cutters, they didn't question whether the design was officially approved or whether it met formal specifications. They built what was needed with the materials available, working around the clock because the deadline mattered. This pragmatic, results-oriented approach characterized American military operations throughout the war. The contrast with German military culture was instructive. The Wehrmacht was a superbly professional force, well-trained, experienced, tactically sophisticated. But German military organization was hierarchical and formal, with decisions flowing from higher command downward. Field improvisation was discouraged in favor of following established doctrine. When German soldiers encountered unexpected situations, they waited for orders rather than improvising solutions. This meant German forces were often slow to adapt to changing battlefield conditions. The Hedgerow fighting exposed these organizational differences. German defenders used the bocage brilliantly within their existing tactical doctrine, but they didn't develop innovations that might have made their defense even more effective. They fought as they'd been trained to fight, competently but inflexibly. American forces, by contrast, experimented constantly. When standard tactics failed, they tried new approaches. Some experiments failed, but the willingness to experiment eventually produced solutions like the Cullen cutter. The legacy of the Hedgerow cutter extended beyond Normandy into subsequent campaigns. American armor continued using the devices through France and into Germany whenever Hedgerow-like terrain was encountered. The psychological confidence the cutters provided to tankers persisted even when the actual Hedgerow country was left behind. Crews felt they had a tool that could handle difficult terrain, which made them more willing to take calculated risks in combat. British forces incorporated the lessons learned from Normandy into their tactical doctrine. The prongs devices developed for British tanks remained in production and use through the end of the war. Commonwealth forces learned to value field innovations and to maintain closer connections between frontline units and technical support organizations. The Hedgerow experience taught Allied forces that technological superiority wasn't just about having better equipment, but about adapting equipment to battlefield conditions faster than the enemy could respond. The broader principle, that simple solutions to complex problems often come from unexpected sources, became embedded in American military culture. Subsequent wars saw numerous examples of soldiers improvising solutions that formal development programs had missed. In Vietnam, helicopter door gunners jury-rigged improved weapons mounts. In Iraq, soldiers welded scrap metal to vehicles to create improvised armor against roadside bombs. The spirit of Roberts suggesting saw teeth and Cullen making it work lived on in every combat zone where soldiers faced problems their equipment wasn't designed to solve. Modern military technology development explicitly tries to incorporate this lesson. The U.S. military maintains rapid fielding programs designed to identify soldier innovations and scale them quickly. Special operations forces have formal processes for submitting equipment modifications and testing new approaches. The goal is to create organizational systems that capture the kind of innovation that happened accidentally in Normandy. But technology and formal processes can't replicate the essential human element. Someone like Cullen, who heard an idea others dismissed, recognized its potential, and had the skills and determination to make it real. That combination of practical knowledge, creative thinking, and execution ability remains rare, regardless of organizational structure. The Hedgerow cutter worked because one person connected the right idea with the right materials at the right moment. That's not a process that can be systematized. The tactical lessons from Normandy's hedgerows influenced military thinking about terrain and combined arms warfare for decades afterward. Military schools used the bocage fighting as a case study in how terrain shapes tactics, how unexpected obstacles can neutralize technological advantages, and how innovation under pressure becomes a combat multiplier. The principle that ground truth matters more than theoretical planning became a touchstone for military education. For the veterans who lived through those 7 weeks in the hedgerows, the memory remained visceral decades later. Oral histories collected from Normandy veterans consistently described the bocage fighting as more psychologically difficult than the D-Day landings themselves. The constant tension, the inability to see more than one field ahead, the knowledge that any advance might trigger an ambush, these conditions ground down soldiers' nerves in ways that dramatic set-piece battles didn't. The relief when the breakout finally came, when American forces escaped the bocage into open country, was palpable in veterans' recollections. The French civilians who lived through the battle carried their own memories. The destruction of Norman villages and farms was extensive. Entire towns like La Chapelle and Jouga were wiped off the map by the carpet bombing that preceded Operation Cobra. Thousands of French civilians died in the liberation of their own country, caught between German occupiers and Allied liberators. The reconstruction of Normandy took years, with hedgerows rebuilt, farms restored, communities recreated from rubble. Modern Normandy still bears subtle traces of the 1944 battle. Some hedgerows show irregular growth patterns where they were torn apart by tanks and later regrew. Farmers occasionally unearth unexploded ordnance or fragments of military equipment. The terrain itself hasn't changed fundamentally. The bocage is still hedgerow country, though modern agricultural practices have reduced the density of hedgerows compared to 1944. Visitors can still see what made the terrain so difficult for attacking forces and so advantageous for defenders. Museums in Normandy preserve examples of the Coulin hedgerow cutter and tell the story of how this simple innovation helped break the stalemate. The devices themselves, crude assemblies of welded steel, look impossibly simple when displayed in museums. It's hard to reconcile their basic construction with their strategic importance, but that gap between simplicity and significance is precisely what makes the story compelling. The most important innovations aren't always the most complex. The broader narrative of Normandy, from the D-Day landings through the breakout and the race across France, remains one of World War II's most studied campaigns. The hedgerow phase, less dramatic than the beach landings or the liberation of Paris, sometimes gets compressed in popular accounts. But for the soldiers who fought through the bocage, those 7 weeks were the campaign. Everything else was prologue or aftermath. The hedgerows were where the Normandy campaign was won or lost, and the hedgerows were where a Tennessee soldier, whose name we'll never know, suggested putting saw teeth on a tank, where a 29-year-old sergeant from New Jersey took that suggestion seriously and made it work, where army welders transformed German beach obstacles into tank modifications that broke a strategic stalemate, where American pragmatism and improvisational skill turned a seemingly insurmountable obstacle into just another problem to be solved with ingenuity and scrap steel. Curtis Coulin never claimed to be a hero. He tried consistently to share credit with Roberts and with the many other soldiers who contributed ideas and labour to solving the hedgerow problem. But history, with its need for names and narratives, remembered Cullen's name and forgot Roberts's. The device became the Cullen cutter, and Cullen became, as historian Max Hastings noted, a very American kind of national hero. The practical problem solver who saved lives and changed the course of battle, not through traditional military valor, but through creative thinking and skilled execution. The final accounting of the hedgerow cutter's impact can never be precisely calculated. How many American lives were saved because tanks could cross hedgerows safely? How much time was saved in the race to liberate France? How many German divisions escaped destruction because the breakout was delayed 7 weeks? These are counterfactual questions that history can't definitively answer. What we know for certain is that Operation Cobra succeeded, that American armor exploited that success by moving freely through terrain that had previously constrained them, and that the Cullen cutter was a necessary enabler of that mobility. In the end, the story of the hedgerow cutter is a story about how wars are actually won. not primarily through brilliant strategy or overwhelming force, though both matter, but through the accumulation of practical solutions to immediate problems, solved by people close enough to the problems to understand them clearly. The planners in London hadn't solved the Hedgerow problem because they'd never experienced trying to drive a 30-ton tank over a centuries-old embankment under enemy fire. Curtis Cullen solved it because he had. That's the lesson that transcends the specific tactical situation of Normandy 1944. Complex problems often have simple solutions, but finding those solutions requires listening to the people who encounter the problems directly. Organizations, whether militaries or corporations or governments, succeed when they create environments where a Roberts can suggest an idea that sounds ridiculous, a Cullen can take that idea seriously and develop it, and a Bradley can recognize its value and scale it across the force. The Hedgerow cutter worked because at every level of that chain, people did what the system needed rather than what the system prescribed. Roberts spoke up even though his idea invited ridicule. Cullen experimented even though he had no official authorization to modify army equipment. Bradley adopted the innovation even though it hadn't gone through formal testing and approval processes. That flexibility, that willingness to trust practical judgment over procedural correctness, was as much a weapon as the steel prongs welded to Sherman tanks. 70 years after Curtis Cullen died, the principle he demonstrated remains relevant. Innovation under pressure, creative problem-solving with available resources, listening to unconventional ideas, these capabilities matter as much in the 21st century as they did in 1944. The technologies change, the specific problems evolve, but the human factors remain constant. Someone has to notice the problem. Someone has to imagine a solution. Someone has to make it real, and someone has to recognize its value and implement it at scale. The Hedgerow cutter didn't win World War II. No single innovation or battle or decision won a conflict that sprawled across continents and consumed millions of lives over 6 years. But the Hedgerow cutter helped win Normandy, and Normandy helped win Western Europe, and Western Europe was one of the decisive theatres that brought Nazi Germany to unconditional surrender. In that chain of causation, the crude assemblies of German steel welded to American tanks played their part, one link in a chain forged by millions of individual contributions. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.